Okay, so let's talk about the president. So what does it take to become president of the United States of America? There are formal qualifications as written in the Constitution, and there are only 3 of them, which surprises some people. The 3 qualifications per the Constitution are: you must be a natural-born citizen, you must be at least 35 years old, and you must have been living in the United States for at least 14 years. So who does this rule out? This basically means that you cannot be born of another country and have earned your citizenship. It means that you can't be born here, move somewhere until you're 35, and then come back and try to run for office. And so, for example, Arnold Schwarzenegger could not run for president because he is not a natural-born citizen. But it's kind of interesting when you look at how few official requirements there are to become leader of essentially the free world. There have been patterns that we've seen in all previous presidents. The majority of them tend to be white, male, and Protestant. There are, of course, a couple of exceptions. The first and only non-white person to be elected president is the current president, Barack Obama. They've all been male. What do you think? Paget, 2016. Should I run? Break some barriers? Become female president? What do you think? And then the only non-Protestant president was actually John F. Kennedy, who was Catholic, but all other presidents before him identified as Protestant. There are some other trends that we see with the presidents. They tend to be very highly educated, have great college credentials. They tend to be from upper middle class. Being rich definitely is an asset if you are planning to campaign and run for an elected office. There are exceptions. There are always the legends, the stories about Abraham Lincoln being born in a one-room log cabin, not having much of a formal education, but the majority of our presidents have all been highly educated and loaded. Okay, so once you are in office, what does that mean? Until 1951, there actually was no official term limit. George Washington actually established sort of just the precedent of only running twice and then making room for someone else. And so it wasn't until Congress proposed the 22nd Amendment in 1951 that actually set a quantifiable limit on the number of times that someone can run. So you can run for 2 4-year terms. They do not need to be consecutive. So the famous example of that is Grover Cleveland is the only president to have served 2 non-consecutive terms. But once you serve your 2 terms, you are out. Now, someone actually can be eligible to serve as president for 10 years. So how does this happen? Well, if a vice president takes over the position of president in the last 2 terms of the outgoing president's term, then that vice president can actually run for 2 more terms as president. Hopefully I didn't confuse you. So if the vice president takes over, and he takes over in the last half of the current term, he is eligible to run for 2 more terms. 2 more terms means 8 years, plus the 1 or 2 other years that he gets when he takes over. So you can run for 9 or serve for 9 or 10 years. Let me know. That was kind of difficult to explain. So let me know if that needs to be cleared up in class. Presidential succession. So what happens if the president can no longer fulfill his duty? So the vice president from the get-go was appointed as the person who will succeed the president if the president leaves office. This has happened. 9 presidents have left, one of them through resignation, the others through death. And the 25th Amendment set up and established who would take over if there is a vice president who cannot take over for the outgoing president. And so, again, until the 25th Amendment, we never really, not that we didn't think about it, but we haven't had to think, okay, well, if the president and the vice president cannot serve, who takes over? So let's look at the list. Vice president is number 1 in line. Speaker of the House is number 2. President pro tempore of the Senate is number 3. And then we move over to the cabinet. And so we know that the cabinet is made up of 14 secretaries of, and including the Attorney General. And the order in which they were added, that position was added to the cabinet, is the order in which they are in line of succession. So what that means is the Secretary of State was the first position appointed in the cabinet. Secretary of Treasury was after that. The former Secretary of War, now Secretary of Defense, et cetera, et cetera. So you notice Secretary of Homeland. I don't know why my toolbar just showed up at the bottom. That's kind of annoying. What happens? Now I just opened. What's going on? I'm really sorry, students. Stop. Okay. So Secretary of Homeland Security. A lot of people might think that person sounds really important. That is a title we hear a lot. That person obviously knows what's going on in our country and other countries. That would be a good choice. But because that position was added after 2001 and is the most recent appointee to the cabinet, he is last in line. Wah wah. What else? So we've yet, knock on wood, to reach a situation where we've even had to go to the Speaker of the House. And it's kind of an interesting process because if the vice president takes over, which has happened 9 times, the new president, the former vice president, gets to handpick his new vice president. So even though we have this nice numbered ordered list, that does not mean that everyone moves up a spot. So for example, when the vice president becomes president, the speaker then doesn't take over as vice president and pull all these other 16 people up behind him. The vice president, if he takes over, gets to handpick his new vice president. And this has, one time in particular, transpired into a really unusual event. So when Richard Nixon was president, his first vice president was a man named Spiro Agnew. Remember that name if you're playing Scrabble. You will get a lot of points. Spiro Agnew actually resigned from his post as vice president, and Richard Nixon got to handpick the new vice president. Who better to choose than an all-American football player from the University of Michigan, go Big Blue, Gerald Ford. So Gerald Ford went from being sort of a humble, not very well-known representative from Michigan to vice president. Shortly thereafter, President Nixon resigned, and we see the order of succession go in motion. Vice president was Gerald Ford. He now is president of the United States. So his notorious claim is that Gerald Ford is the only person to serve president whose name was never, ever on a ballot. All the other vice presidents who have taken over or succeeded for a president in history were originally on the ticket with the president. But because Gerald Ford replaced an old vice president, he was never on a ballot. So that's just kind of a little fun fact for you. Probably won't be on the test, but maybe on Jeopardy. Okay. And then just a little side note here. So both houses of Congress need to approve a newly appointed vice president. Also, cabinet members can be former presidents. If someone has been president, they are not excluded from being able to be appointed to a position that is in the line of succession. So for example, Bill Clinton is a former president. Let's say he is appointed the new Secretary of Agriculture, because maybe he knows a lot about crops. If he is eligible, and if there was some kind of catastrophic event where we needed to move to number 9 on the list, if it was a former president, we would just skip him, and then the Secretary of Commerce would actually be the new serving president. Okay, what if we, the people, specifically Congress, would like to remove the president from office? The word impeachment is really, really misunderstood. A lot of people assume that impeachment means that the person is automatically removed from office. This is not the case. Impeachment is an accusation voted on by a simple majority in the House. So the House of Representatives has the power to impeach an official, so to accuse a federal official of an offense. But it's the House that actually will try and conduct the trial to see if there's enough evidence to remove that person from office. So 2 presidents have been impeached, Andrew Johnson and Bill Clinton. So the House voted in a simple majority to impeach each of them. They were both brought forth on charges for high crimes and misdemeanors. But the Senate did not reach a vote to remove either of them from office. A lot of people think Richard Nixon was impeached. He actually resigned before the impeachment process started, but it's a pretty safe bet that had he stayed in office, he probably would have been our first and only president to have been impeached and removed. But he kind of punked out before he could be removed.
Allah.